Will you join me in prayer? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, we've been focusing on wilderness experiences here at First Congregational Church for the past few weeks, and we're going to continue to hold that focus all the way up to the beginning of Holy Week on Palm Sunday, March 20th. We all have wilderness in our lives. Circumstances and experiences that are unfamiliar to us, where the path forward is uncharted, where there are no patterns for us to follow, and the old familiar ways of doing things are no longer effective or feasible. Most of us haven't intentionally wandered into our wilderness places. We are thrust into them by circumstances that are largely beyond our ability to control. When Kellogg instituted Project K and began outsourcing jobs to cut their production costs, people in our community with stable employment and steady paychecks suddenly found themselves out of work and desperately trying to find new ways of earning a living and paying their bills. Many of them hadn't been in the job market for a long time. They hadn't been networking. They didn't know about LinkedIn. They didn't have an up-to-date resume. In a very short period of time, they went from a life that was stable and familiar to them to a life filled with uncertainty and anxiety. They were in wilderness. When a marriage suddenly ends by death or divorce, the partnership that once oriented that person's life is suddenly dissolved. The daily habits and routines, the familiar patterns of interaction, the dependable and predictable presence of someone who accompanied them through every day of their life is suddenly gone, and nothing feels right. The division of labor that once made running a household manageable is no longer operative, and every burden gets carried alone. They are in wilderness. When an unexpected shadow shows up on your scan, or you listen to the oncologist explaining the diagnosis, or when joints stop working or memory begins fading, you suddenly find yourself unable to continue living the way you have been living. The home that once housed you is inaccessible. The vehicle that once transported you is now inoperable. The tasks that you once were able to perform alone are now impossible for you to do. You are in wilderness. Parents frequently find themselves in wilderness spaces as their sons and daughters transition from adorable, playful, fun-loving children into moody, brooding teenagers who are constantly trying on new personalities, new wardrobes, new reference groups as they struggle to grow into their own independence and sort out who they are apart from their parents and their siblings and their teachers and their peers. Suddenly, all of the familiar patterns and rituals of interaction are met with resistance and opposition, and no one knows how to move forward together. The family is in wilderness. Today, the church is in wilderness. The programs and patterns and rituals that once attracted and held people in faithful covenant with each other are no longer effective. Our children Our grandchildren aren't joining us in the pews the way they did generations before. Worship attendance peaked in America in the 1950s. Here at our church, Koinonia has lots of preschool and early elementary kids on Sunday morning, but here at our traditional service, we rarely have more than 2 or 3 children. The number of people who pledge their financial support to fund the church's ministries keeps shrinking, making our operating budget unsustainable over the long term. Each of us, in our own personal lives, and all of us collectively, as a community of faith, find ourselves in wilderness places, not by choice, but by circumstances that are beyond our ability to control. We didn't choose to be in wilderness, but we do get to choose how we will navigate the wilderness that we're in. And so every week during this worship series, we're reaching back into our tradition to ask what lessons we can learn from our ancestors that can help us navigate wilderness faithfully. Today we heard the story of the covenant that the liberated Hebrew slaves made with God at Mount Horeb, in the passage that we often refer to as the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments aren't arbitrary rules that people decided to live by. They were rules that put boundaries on people's fears. When we're in wilderness, fear dominates our lives. We live on the edge of panic, worrying that we won't have enough of what we need, that we don't know enough of what we have to understand, that we aren't strong enough to do what needs to be done, that we aren't courageous enough to face the challenges that need to be faced. Before they gathered at the foot of Mount Horeb, the Hebrew people had been living in a state of perpetual crisis. Their sole preoccupation had been with their own survival. Day after day, they worried about getting enough water to slake their thirst and foraging enough food to satiate their hunger. When they were slaves in Egypt, they never had to worry about having enough to eat or enough to drink. Those things were always provided for them. But now that they were on their own, after Moses had liberated them from their slavery and they were wandering through the wilderness of the Sinai, no one was providing for their sustenance. They were on their own. Hunger and thirst dominated their lives and caused them to complain bitterly against Moses for leading them out into the wilderness to kill them with hunger and thirst. But when Moses came down from the mountain, he brought with him rules that would help establish some boundaries and set some limits to contain their fear. The laws of the covenant helped establish safe space for the Hebrew people to live in right relationship with God and each other and themselves. Their fears had reduced them to living like beasts in the wilderness. But the commandments reminded them of who they were and what they valued. Instead of living in fear, the commandments help them live by the three great loves that guide the lives of all people of faith: love of God, love of neighbor, love of self. God commanded, remember that I am God, and you are not. I'm the only one who has ultimate power. Only I can make the rain fall and the sun rise. Only I can speckle the night sky with stars and create the intricate beauty of a flower. Only I can breathe the breath of life into mortal flesh. You don't have the power or the wisdom that you need to find your way through wilderness. But I do. So stay close to me. Don't give anyone else the power or the authority that rightly belongs to me. Don't set up any false gods, not security, not prosperity, not success. Don't bow down and worship anyone or anything but me. Don't let anyone steal my joy from you. Don't let yourself become enslaved by your work. Every week, hold a day for rest and renewal, a day to appreciate the blessings of life, a day to be fully present to the people you love, a day to rejoice and be glad. Love the gift of life that I've given to you. Remember that your parents and your siblings and your neighbors and even your enemies are as precious to me as you are. So treat them with dignity and respect. Honor them. Safeguard their welfare. Protect them from harm. Those rules that we know today as the 10 Commandments aren't ends in and of themselves. They help us navigate the wilderness places of our lives. They keep our fears from getting the best of us by setting the boundaries that help us live in right relationship with God and neighbor and self. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about the same three boundaries that liberate us from our fears, building on the imagery of the 21st chapter of the Revelation of John. He talked about the length and breadth and height of a complete life. In a sermon that he delivered at the Friendship Baptist Church on February 28th, 1960, King said, "The length of life is not its duration, not how long it lasts, not how long you live, but it's the push of a life forward to achieve its inner powers and ambition. It's the inward concern for one's own welfare. The breadth of life is the outreach, the outward concern for the welfare of others. And the height of life is the upward reach for God. If life is to be complete, these three must be together. In other words, life at its best is something of a triangle. At one angle stands the individual person. At the other angle stands the other person. At the top stands the supreme person, God. If your life is to be complete, all three must work harmoniously together and be properly cultivated. For the complete life is the three-dimensional life. Life in the wilderness can quickly become one-dimensional. It can reduce us to our most basic instincts for survival. Fear can quickly come to dominate our lives in the wilderness, and fear never brings out the best in us. Fear makes us suspicious. Fear isolates us. We withdraw in fear and cut ourselves off from the help of other people. We stop reaching out and offering the gifts that we have to share with other people. Our sole preoccupation becomes our own survival. And God disappears from our lives. Instead of trusting in the power of God, we make ourselves God. We convince ourselves that we are completely on our own, that there is no one who can deliver us through the wilderness, no one to accompany us, no one to sustain us. The laws of the covenant that God formed with the Hebrew people in the wilderness of the Sinai are the same laws that help us navigate our wilderness faithfully. They set boundaries on our fears. They keep our lives three-dimensional. They hold safe space for the length and the breadth and the height of a complete life. Amen.